Well, let me begin by saying it's a great pleasure and privilege to be here and to talk about the new atheism, and really to help you have conversations with your friends about what the new atheism is, and perhaps even more importantly, what Christianity has to say in response. And I hope that in talking about these themes this morning, I'll be able to touch on some of the themes that matter to you. I think one of my primary jobs is simply to reassure you that Christianity makes sense, that it can stand up against the kind of questions that the new atheism is asking, and also to ask some hard questions about where the new atheism itself is going. A biblical text on which we could anchor our thoughts this morning will be 1 Peter chapter 3. Always be prepared to give an answer to those who ask for a reason for the hope that is within you. And it sets out very clearly this idea that people will want to ask us questions and that we shouldn't be frightened. We should feel able to say something in response and be reassured that there is lots that can be said in response. So, the new atheism. It began in 2006 with books like Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion. It made media headlines, very understandably, because it had very punchy, simple slogans. And that's the kind of thing that the media likes. But there is always this danger that what is simple turns out simply to be simplistic. And as you probably know, the new atheism is now beginning to retreat. The media have generally turned against it. Richard Dawkins, unfortunately, is now more a figure of fun than a figure of veneration. So I think there is a turn in the tide. But the questions being asked, I think, are still important, and I want to reflect with you on these. So let's begin by asking a very obvious question. Just how serious is the new atheism? How deep is its social traction? How much influence is it actually exerting? And again, if you read some of the media, you'll perhaps gain the impression that there is a tidal wave in which Britain is turning into an atheist nation because of the brave and bold endeavors of Richard Dawkins. I wonder if that really is right. When I was researching a book recently, I noticed a newspaper article by a journalist very sympathetic to new atheism, which talked about a movement here in London that was the biggest, the best organized atheist movement in the country. It was called the London Brights. Well, the London Brights are certainly very well organized because in those days they had their own website. And this website gave details of all their meetings, who spoke at the meetings, how many turned up, and also a 1 to 5 rating system, so you could actually vote on how good the meeting was. Now, what was really interesting was this. They began just before Dawkins' book appeared, and they met about every few months. Then in 2006, when Richard Dawkins' book appeared, they began to meet every month. Attendance went up. 2007, Christopher Hitchens published his book, God is Not Great, one of the great manifestos of the new atheism. Every month they meet, the attendance goes up a little bit further. Then in 2008, the meetings begin to become more infrequent. 2009, only 2 meetings. 2010, 1, and then that's it. I want to suggest to you that the novelty value had simply worn off. But here's what's really interesting, the numbers. They had one meeting where they said, do you want to meet a bunch of friendly atheists? Then come with us and watch the Da Vinci Code. Now, I mean, how could you resist an invitation like that? Well, actually, rather a lot of people did resist that invitation. The attendance for that meeting was 4. Now, you're waiting for the word 1,000 to be mentioned. No, 4. The biggest attendance was at a meeting at which Channel 4 sent in the cameras. It was about the future of atheism in England. It was a big event. There were 36 people there. I want to suggest you look around this congregation and make the point. This is not a movement that secured widespread support. And why not? Well, because it basically has not got something at its heart that draws people in, that changes their lives, that gives them a reason to hope and a reason to live. And it seems to me there's a lot we can say about this, and I'm going to do that in the rest of this talk. And in many ways, this talk is about apologetics. What is apologetics? Well, it's about trying to translate our faith into language our culture can understand. It's about trying to, unwrap these wonderful words like redemption, atonement, resurrection, and explaining them to our culture in terms it can understand, so they're able to connect up with the reality of the Christian faith. It's about defending the faith. That means, in effect, saying, look, there's some very good questions being asked. The new atheism asks some. The answers it gives, I have to say, aren't very good, but it's asking them, and there are answers that we can give. I want simply to say to each of you here this morning that you could be the point of contact between the Christian faith and someone in your family, at your place of work, or in your group of friends. Think of your strategic importance. And also, it's about commending. It's in effect saying, let me tell you what Christianity is really about. And when your new atheist friends, and there may be some of them around, say to you, well, of course, I can't believe in Christianity because it's got this ridiculous idea of God as a tyrant, you can say, well, actually, I'm a Christian, if you don't mind me saying so. I don't believe in the God who's a tyrant. Let me tell you about the God I do believe in. And there is so much that you can say. So let's begin to look at some of the questions the new atheism is asking. Number one, the argument that belief in God is simply irrational. It's about running away from reality. It's about not thinking about faith. And it's simple, but again, I want to say to you, it really is simplistic. Richard Dawkins, at several points, puts forward the immensely learned idea that belief in God is a bit like believing in Santa Claus. It's something you buy into when you're young, and then you grow out of it when you grow up. It's a childish thing, and you set it to one side when you grow up. Now, I have to tell you that I probably stopped believing in Santa Claus when I was about 4, but I didn't bother telling my parents this because, as you probably know, there are certain fringe benefits with this. So I thought I would just keep it going a little bit longer. But here's the point I want to make. I was an atheist as a younger man. When I was at high school in Belfast, studying sciences, for me it was the most obvious of all obvious things, that science gets rid of belief in God, that only those who are mad, sad, or bad believe in God. End of story. And then, when I went to Oxford as a student, I discovered God at the age of 18. That's not about childish belief I leave behind. It's about something I discovered and embraced and continue to find exciting and fulfilling as a grown person. We just need to challenge this simplistic thing, belief in God is childish. There's one sense only in which that is right, and that is that even a child can begin to see why belief in God might be exciting and transformative. But it possesses a depth and a richness which you begin to appreciate in all its fullness when you begin to grow up. And I discovered Christianity when I was 18, and it's been part of my life ever since, and I've simply grown into it. And its reasonableness is something that really impresses me. C.S. Lewis was mentioned a moment ago. Let me give you a quote from C.S. Lewis, which I think really helps us in thinking about the reasonableness of faith. This is from the end of his essay, Is Theology Poetry? And if you're interested in the answer to that question, it all depends what you mean by poetry and what you mean by theology. But here is the final sentence of this great paper. Listen to it. I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not just because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. Now, it's a beautiful quote. And the point that Lewis is making is, look, there are reasons for thinking there's a sun there. And one of them is that it lights things up. And Lewis's point about Christianity is that there are good reasons for thinking there is a God, but one of them is the ability of God to make sense of things. God is like a sun lighting up the intellectual landscape. We see things more clearly. We can see further. It's all about light being cast even in the Shadowlands. Christianity makes sense of things. It makes sense of the deepest longings of the human heart. It makes sense of what we observe in history. It makes sense of why science works. And I'll come back to that later in this talk. And Lewis's point is that Christianity gives you this way of looking at things, which enables you to see things as they really are and rejoice in them. Now, Lewis is worth reading, but let's go back to that New Atheist critique. Very often, a simplistic New Atheist mantra goes like this: we only believe things that can be proved, unlike you fools who believe anything. Well, I want you to challenge that. What is there that actually can be proved? And as you all know, I think, absolutely rigorous proof is limited to mathematics and to logic. And those are cold truths that do not impact on real life. 2 and 2 makes 4, I assure you, is absolutely true. And if you needed to, you could stake your life on that. But what kind of life is based on 2 and 2 make 4? Is that going to give you a reason to get up in the morning? No. Here's the point that Lewis, who himself was an atheist as a younger man, made. He said, I believed in a glib and shallow rationalism. And the point he's making is good. It is that these things that can be proved in logic or in mathematics are shallow truths. They do not impact on life. They are existentially insignificant. The great truths, the truths on which you and I base our lives, are things that actually lie beyond the human ability to prove, and that goes for atheism as well. I had a conversation with a politician the other day. I don't have many of these, but this is one that stuck in my mind. And he was telling to me how much he enjoyed the New Atheism. I said, why? Because it proves things, I said. Oh, that's interesting, I said. What sort of things really matter to you, I asked him. That all people are equal and must be treated as such. And I said, I agree with you very much. Could you prove that to me? There was what I would call an awkward silence. He said, well, no, of course I can't. It was stupid. And I said, just remind me why you like the New Atheism. I see your point, he said. And really, when you come to the big truths about life, the truths by which we live, they lie beyond absolute proof. They are not irrational. It's just that reason isn't big enough, good enough, to be able to grasp them in all their fullness. You think about this. Here is a Universal Declaration of Human Rights from 1948. We believe that all people have equal rights. I believe that too, but I can't prove it, and nobody can. The great truths of politics, or I should say beliefs of politics, ethical values. Rape is wrong, for example. These are not things that can be proved. And the real difficulty that New Atheism finds itself in is, having said proof is what matters, they end up in effect saying, of course, we only use that to judge religious people. When it comes to our own beliefs, well, of course, we are rational people, so the fact that we can't prove our own beliefs doesn't really matter. So there is, I think, a real need to realize the big truths, the truths that give us a basis on which to live, are so great. They lie beyond the ability of human reason to demonstrate, to prove. Sir Isaiah Berlin is a great intellectual historian who died about 20 years ago. And he once looked at the 20th century and said, look, when I look at what I see out there, the beliefs people have, there are 3 kinds. The ones that can be proved by reason, the ones that can be proved by science, and the ones that can't be proved by either of those. And the point he made is that all the truths that really matter, what I've described as the truths by which we live, are in that 3rd category. They're not irrational. Here's the point I'm making. It's not that belief in God is irrational, going against reason. It goes beyond reason. Reason points us in the right direction, then says, sorry, I can't go any further. Faith just says, we are going where you're taking us. And God is there beyond the limits of reason. Richard Dawkins is imprisoned in a world, a cold world, a small world of what reason is able to prove. And as most intellectual historians will tell you, the 20th century has been a revolt against being imprisoned in that rationalist cage. And you and I need to exult that our faith allows us to break free from that and discover the life-giving and life-changing message of the Christian gospel. So let me move on and make a point. I've used the phrase existential inadequacy to refer to atheism. Let me explain what that means. When I was growing up in Northern Ireland, I was an atheist. I was an atheist for a number of reasons. One of them was, it seemed to me, science made you an atheist. That was just the way things were. I also noticed that in Northern Ireland, religion was a cause of tension, even violence, back in the 1960s when I was growing up. And it seemed to be the most obvious of all obvious things that if there was no religion, there'd be no religious tension or violence. Therefore, get rid of religion, the world is a better place. But I began to experience doubts about being an atheist. And there were several of them. One was that actually it turned out not to be as intellectually rigorous as I'd thought. But the most important thing, I think, looking back on it, was my realization that it just didn't do anything. It didn't excite me. It didn't give me a passion, a love. It was almost like a dead, uninteresting, boring way of looking at things. And that seems to me to be a point that we need to linger over. What is atheism saying that gets us excited, that makes us want to go out and proclaim it from the rooftops? Let me tell you what I discovered. What I discovered was that atheism was bleak. It, in effect, offered virtually nothing. And when I was younger, I used to think, right, it has to be right, because nobody's going to believe this stuff, because it's so dull and dreary. So therefore, the dullness of it became a reason for thinking it might be right. And then I began to talk to my Christian friends at university, and I began to realize that something terrible was wrong. That they, A, seemed to have the better arguments, and B, they had something at their heart, which I didn't have, but which gave them a life-giving basis for what they saw as being the meaning of life. In Greek, there are two words for life, bios and zoe. Bios means biological existence, getting by from one day to the next. Zoe is about life that's really worth living, life with a purpose. And what I discovered is that Christianity is about stopping just existing and having life in all its fullness. And I found that to be utterly transformative. And I know many of you here today will have found exactly the same thing. Let's go back to that dullness of atheism. I was talking to a group of atheists about 4 or 5 years ago, and we were talking about Richard Dawkins as it happened, and we were discussing what we were each doing on Sunday. And I told them I was going to a local Christian church and we'd be worshiping the living God. It'd really be very exciting. I asked them what they were doing. Well, they said, we think we're going to get together for some sandwiches and a cup of tea, and we're going to watch a Richard Dawkins video. And, it just struck me, that actually people gather around the objects of their adoration. There has to be something that we gather around that excites us, that gives us purpose and direction. Here you have worship, which is in effect focusing your thoughts on a living God who excites you, who gives you the sense of passion, who really begins to inject energy and vitality into your lives. They were watching a Richard Dawkins video, which actually I think they might have seen before. So I wasn't really quite sure what was so exciting about this. Anyway, we parted more or less friends, and I'm sure the conversation will continue. But I think, go back to Richard Dawkins' phrase, listen to, C.S. Lewis's phrase, a glib and shallow rationalism. That's atheism. And what you need to say to your friends is, look, you have imprisoned yourself in a rationalist cage. There is life on the other side. You need to discover that life in all its fullness. And that, thank God, is what Christianity is all about. But a major theme in the New Atheism is that science gives us the answers. And it's a major theme in Richard Dawkins, and certainly when I was myself a younger man studying science, it seemed to me that atheism was just the inevitable outcome of being a scientist. And I have to say, at high school, I used to be an extremely aggressive atheist who rubbished the views of my friends around me. In fact, when I listen to Richard Dawkins these days, I have to say I get almost nostalgic because it reminds me of the way I used to be when I was 16. However, I have moved on since then. So let's think about science. I want to begin by saying that science is great. My first degree was in chemistry, and then I did a doctorate in molecular biology. So, I'm in love with science. But I'm a critical lover, the sort of person who wants to ask hard questions and who is absolutely convinced that science has its limits. And that's the key point. Science is great when it works, but it works in a certain area and not in others. Now, I've been a bit critical of Richard Dawkins, so let me mention something on which he and I are agreed. In his book, A Devil's Chaplain, published in 2003, he says these words, and I put a big tick beside these in my margins of that book. Science has no means of telling us what is ethical. Let me repeat that. Science has no means of telling us what is ethical. Now, I think he's absolutely right. But let me put it to you that for most of you here today, that actually is quite a big issue. What is good? How do I lead the good life? How do I behave well and faithfully with my friends and family? What should I be doing to be a good person? These are critical questions for all of us. And Dawkins rightly says, science doesn't tell us the answer. So do we then say, right, science can't answer that question, so that's it? We just say, we can't know the answers, let's go and make things up. And that seems to me what Richard Dawkins is suggesting. Here's a quote from his book, River Out of Eden. Many of you will know it. The universe we observe has exactly the properties we would expect. If there is at bottom no meaning, no purpose, no good, no evil, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. In other words, if there is something called good, it's something we've made up. I want to suggest to you that there's nothing wrong with science. It's just that it focuses on certain questions and leaves others wide open, including the question of God, including the question of meaning and purpose. Let me quote to you from Sir Peter Medawar, who won the Nobel Prize in Medicine for his work on immunology. He wrote a book towards the end of his life called The Limits of Science. And although he was a bit of a rationalist himself, he just said, look, it's obvious science has limits. It cannot answer questions like, what is the purpose of everything? Why are we here? And for all of us, that question, why are we here, is a big one. It's a real question, it's a valid question, and science isn't going to answer it. Listen very carefully. Science can tell us how we came to be here, but not why we are here. And for all of you, the question, what are we here for? What are we meant to be doing with life is important. We all need a vision of what we think life's all about, what God wants us to do. And that's a big issue for all of us. Science is great in its own area, but when it trespasses into other areas, it begins to go very badly wrong indeed. Richard Dawkins, in effect, says science leads to atheism, but that's a very simplistic and rather premature conclusion. Other atheist scientists would say something like this. Science actually can't comment on the God question at all. And science, in effect, betrays itself. It, in effect, brings disrepute on itself if it starts messing around in the God question. But Dawkins, I think, would then say, well, of course, science has advanced a lot in the last 100 years, and it has been bad news for faith. Well, I have to say we must be reading different history books. Suppose you and I were meeting here 100 years ago. And suppose we were talking about the origins of the universe. Well, you know, it'd be a very short conversation because the scientific consensus of 1913 was that the universe has always been here. Sure, it's changed a bit, but it was always there. This kind of religious language about creation just made no sense at all. Then, partly in the 1920s, mainly in the 1960s, people began to realize that things were a bit more complicated. And you all know where that line of thought took us. Today, the universe came into being in the moment we call the Big Bang. The language of creation is back on the agenda with a vengeance. And atheists are on the back foot. Well, maybe the universe did come into existence, but that doesn't mean there's a God. It might have caused itself. Well, that's rational, isn't it? So you can see the climate has changed. And I think you and I really need to be aware that the media tells a narrative of science displacing Christianity. The reality is, in many ways, that science is opening up questions that it cannot answer. Like, why are we here? What's the point of life? And you and I have an answer which fits into that very well indeed. So I want to reassure you, there are many scientists who are Christians, and they will tell you why. And I'm going to give you some of the reasons why they find that their faith enriches their science. Number one, because when you look at the world around you as God's creation, and you see its beauty, you look at the night sky, and you say, that is wonderful, you're in effect saying, the beauty of God's creation gives me an indication of what the even greater beauty of God must be like. Think of Psalm 19:1. The heavens declare the glory of the Lord. And my scientist friends will tell me that as they study nature up close and personal, it enhances their appreciation of the wisdom and the beauty of God. Now, there's a thought for you. Secondly, and very importantly, science has to presuppose certain things it cannot prove, like the uniformity of nature. The Christian doctrine of creation gives you that. A law-giving God makes a law-governed reality. So there are many things that could be said here. And if you want to read writers like John Polkinghorne, you'll find material there that will really help you think this through if this is important for you. But let's move on now and look at one of the major critiques that the new atheism makes of religious faith. Faith, they say, is not just irrational. Well, we had a look at that. It also incites people to violence. I want to look at that in a little more detail because I think there is some truth in that, but it is a truth that is only part of a bigger picture. I grew up in Northern Ireland, and, for me, it seemed obvious back in the 1960s that Protestantism and Catholicism were at each other's throats, and that proved religion was damaging. You probably know the story about the Englishman who went to Belfast and unwisely stayed out too late. And as he came back to his hotel very late at night, he was met by a group of youths with baseball bats. And they kind of forced him against the wall, and they looked at him very intently, and they said to him, "Are you a Protestant or are you a Catholic?" Now, the Englishman realized that the answer he gave to that question might be significant. And then he had a moment of absolute genius. "I'm an atheist." There was a silence for only a moment, though. Are you a Protestant atheist or are you a Catholic atheist? But Richard Dawkins, I think, is right, partially right, in making the point that religion can lead to violence. That's right, it can. But let me add two very big footnotes. Footnote number one, it can, but it doesn't have to. And secondly, and so does atheism. Let's look at each of those. Many of you will remember something that happened in October 2006, very shortly after the publication of Dawkins' book, The God Delusion. It happened in a village called Nickel Mines in Pennsylvania. Nickel Mines was a village run by the Amish. And the Amish, I'm sure you know from seeing films like Witness and so on, are very old-fashioned conservative Protestants who kind of ride horse buggies rather than cars and who dress in rather black styles. A gunman broke into one of their schoolhouses and shot dead 5 schoolgirls. It was a small community. You can imagine the absolute trauma. It turned out that the gunman had some kind of grudge against God. He killed girls, then shot himself. The Amish, as you would expect, took the New Testament hugely seriously. What should we do? Well, for them, the basis of Christian ethics is, what would Jesus do? It's a good question. What would Jesus do? And they thought about it, and they thought the answer is obvious. Jesus would forgive, and therefore we must forgive as well. And the gunman's widow said that act of forgiveness allowed me and my family to rebuild our lives. But here's the point. There was no cycle of violence. There was no retribution, because Jesus was the role model for these unfortunate Amish. You think about Jesus. When you think about Jesus and violence, it's about violence being done to Jesus. The crucifixion is a wonderfully rich topic for reflection and meditation for all of us, as our hymns today have made clear. One of the themes is Jesus allowing violence to be done to him and not offering violence in return. That, I think, puts the atheist charge that Christianity leads to violence into proper perspective. Maybe it does, but it shouldn't. And that's a very important point, that Christianity has at its heart a savior, a teacher, who challenges us about our instinct to violence. So I think it's a very important point to make. But secondly, look at the history of atheism itself. Look at its attempts to eliminate religion during the time of the Soviet Union, when state-enforced atheism was the norm. The Soviets began to realize religion was not going away. Even in the 1930s, about 60% still believed in God. So they set about achieving by force what they couldn't achieve by argument. That's why Dawkins is so embarrassed when you suggest that Stalin was an atheist, and therefore atheism has some questions to answer. It does, and they're not going to go away. What I've been talking about really is reassurance. Yes, the new atheism is raising some good questions. And in fact, our culture in general is raising some good questions. And what I want to suggest to you is that we should not be afraid, because there are some very good answers that can be given. And if you and I don't give them, the culture will assume that there are no answers to be given at all. And each of you here this morning could be the turning point in somebody's life. And all you really need to do is to have conversations with people. You don't need to be massively intelligent or well-informed. You can talk about your faith. When one of your friends, new atheist, says, well, of course, Richard Dawkins is right when he says that Christians believe in a violent, nasty God. You can say, look, if you don't mind, I'm a Christian, and that's not the kind of God I believe in. Let me tell you about the God I know and love. You're not just saying they're wrong. You're also saying, let me tell you my side of the story. And you know, our side of the story is rather exciting. And you and I are people who can begin to tell it. But there's another point I want to make here, and I think it's very interesting indeed. If you look at the leading new atheists, Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, Christopher Hitchens, they are all, or in one case were all, men, middle-class men, white men. There is a certain sociological specificity of the new atheism, and that, I think, needs to be pointed out. And more than that, we need to note that the new atheism is incorrigibly modernist. By that I mean relying excessively on reason when it's obvious reason has its limits. Many of you here today will think in a much more postmodern way, where stories are important, where images are story, but where the dominant question is very often going to be, does this work? And we can give a wonderful answer to that question, because each of you in your own way can give an answer to that question. Does Christianity work? Here is how Christianity changed my life. Here is how Christianity now gives me stability, meaning, purpose. This is the difference it makes to me, and by implication could make to you as well. And let's take that idea of story a bit further. Postmodernity really loves stories. It finds arguments rather tedious. But each of us here today can tell two stories very well indeed. One of them is the story of Christianity: creation, fall, redemption, and final consummation. It's a story which makes sense of the riddles of the world around us. But equally, each of us can tell our own story. I've told you a little bit of mine. I've talked a bit about how my faith gives me direction, purpose, and stability, how I found it, and my own story fits into that bigger story of God's purposes. Every single one of you here this morning has a story which is absolutely unique to you. But it becomes even better, even more important, when you connect it up with that bigger story of God. God's story and our individual stories intersect, and where we become part of God's story, that's where things get really interesting. Because when our story is caught up in the story of God's purposes, God's workings in history, we see ourselves as we really are, as people who God loves, who God has called, who God has chosen, who God has empowered, and who wants each of us to do something very special for Him. Now, there is much more that I could say, but really I must begin to bring this talk to a conclusion. I'm going to just make a few points, and then I'm going to end by telling you a story. First point, even atheists have faith. They may protest. They may get very angry if you say that to them. But that's the way it is. And if that is an internal contradiction for them, that's just too bad. I believe there is a God. My atheist friends believe there is no God. Neither of us can prove we're right. Simple as that. The big question is, which of our faiths, because yes, they are faiths, is the better? Better grounded in reality, better grounded in argument, and above all, able to take and change and hold each of our lives. Secondly, that point I made about shallow truths and then the deep truths, which reason can't prove. That's not about running away from reason. It's just realizing that there are some things that are so big and great, we just can't get our minds around them. Many of you here will have studied at college or university. Think of the subjects you studied. Then think yourself back to 10 years earlier, when you were much younger and smaller, would you have been able to understand those things then? No. You needed to expand your minds to be able to cope. The problem is we've all reached our limits, and there is so much more beyond those limits. And God, in his graciousness, reveals, tells us what he's really like. So that in effect, when reason can't reach, God steps in and shows us what he's really like. Here's C.S. Lewis' point. It's a very good point. When God shows us the big picture, a big picture we couldn't figure out for ourselves, we look at this big picture and says, my goodness, that makes sense. And that's a very important point to make. But I promised you I would end with a story. And I will. In 2010, I was speaking at a talk in London, and one of the people in the audience came up to me and asked if I would mind signing one of my books. It was a theology textbook. And so, of course, I'm always very pleased to do that. So while I was signing it, I said to him, how come you got interested in theology? This is the story he told me. I used to be an atheist, and I read Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion. And it just seemed so simplistic. I thought, I need to hear the other side of the question. So he started going to a London church. And when he discovered Christianity as it really was, not the kind of cheap little stereotype in the New Atheist handbooks, but the real thing, he began to realize not only that he was wrong, but that Christianity had an excitement, a wonder that transcended anything he knew in atheism. So to cut a long story short, he became a Christian. Now, the story isn't quite over, because as he turned away, he suddenly turned back and said, by the way, I've got a theological question for you. I thought, oh dear. And here is the question. Since Richard Dawkins was so instrumental in my conversion, should I be thanking God in my prayers for Richard Dawkins? And you know, I'm still thinking about that one. But what I know is that Christianity makes sense. It changes lives. And each of us has the privilege of being able to take that news to our family, our friends, and our neighbors. God bless you as you do just that.